Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out new episodes of the show every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. If you missed an episode or want to get more information about the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Robin Gilthorpe, CEO at WaterSmart Software. Robin, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think what you guys are doing is super important and is really cool. And you have quite an impressive background and you're tackling a huge global issue. But maybe kind of before we get into WaterSmart, let's get to know you a little bit better and kind of cover your background. And maybe we'll start off with where you grew up.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in England, went to school there, and then also in France and in Italy.
Okay.
So I kind of got the travel bug, and I've lived and worked all around the world ever since.
Okay. So what kind of got you kind of traveling all over the world obviously, was it just for work, or did you just kind of want to travel, or kind of what was the reason behind you, kind of moving around so much?
Well, it started to study, and then study became work. And by background, I'm a recovering economist.
Okay.
And a quantitative economist at that. So basically a math kid. And then I somehow got muddled up in the world of computer science and writing algorithms to analyze data, and ended up applying that knowledge both on a technical level and also just in terms of how it gets applied in various different industries. And so I had the opportunity to work in Milan and Madrid and Paris and Hong Kong and Tokyo and New York and here.
Wow, that's quite impressive. So what did you take in university then?
So I did. I started out doing economics. I actually ended up taking a second major as well. I ended up taking Italian as well.
Okay.
But that was kind of largely unrelated. But I tended to do all the quantitative, all the sort of crunchy stats courses, and modeling and so on. And it turns out that that's a good background for somebody who wants to go and apply those capabilities in the real world. Sure.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know you've worked at kind of a bunch of big data kind of analytics companies like you mentioned. So I'm kind of curious, and you don't really have to give me company names, but let's maybe cover a little bit of your professional career and kind of the types of companies you worked at and whatnot, and kind of what led you up to kind of starting WaterSmart.
Yeah, so I had, while I was still in grad school, actually, I ended up working on a trading desk, looking at what various debt, for example, was really worth compared with how it's priced. And what you find out is that everything is mispriced slightly.
Okay.
But there's so much data that it's really hard to find those gems among a mass of grains of sand on the beach, so to speak. So you end up using technology to help you with that. So I applied that in capital markets, and then I applied it in retail finance, and then in national security, and in government sector more generally, and in retail and mobile phones and a whole series of industries. And it's a little bit like when you learn lots of different languages. Even if you never studied linguistics, you start to get a sense of the patterns. Even if you haven't explicitly studied what we now call big data, once you try to apply these techniques to lots of different industries, you work out what's different, and you need to go and learn very aggressively and get up to speed on, but then also what's similar. And that really allows you to build better systems and to build better businesses.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm kind of curious to know what is kind of WaterSmart, and why did you guys kind of start it up?
Yeah, so really this was this was an idea at the kitchen table of my colleague on the management team here, Peter Yollis. And Peter spent, 20 plus years in and around water.
Okay.
On the policy side, the non-profit side, the environmental side, and the financing piece of the equation. So he'd seen this from lots of different areas. And anyone who spends a lot of time in the industry realizes that this is an industry that has been very well served by physical engineering and very poorly served by digital science.
Interesting.
And so he really saw an opportunity to see if there was a business there. And, so one of the other key members on the team here is Doug, who's our CTO. Doug, like me, originally came out of financial markets, and there he learned to build huge systems, very robust systems that could deal with, billions and billions of transactions at a time, and had that sort of deep computer science background. And then, I've spent 20 years in these various different types of analytics and now what we call data science, and particularly in going after specific verticals. So you've got kind of the water science guy, the computer science guy, and the data science guy. And that's really, those are the strands of the DNA that we try to blend throughout the company.
That's very cool. And I think that's kind of like where the future of things are going, right? Where you kind of bring a bunch of people that have specialties in a bunch of kind of different industries, you bring them together to solve kind of these big kind of global problems. So maybe let's kind of cover what exactly you guys do.
Sure. So at the very simplest level, we run a big data platform in the cloud that helps utilities and end customers to make better choices and deliver better outcomes for themselves, for the communities in which they live, for the environment, and also in terms of making sure that the whole sort of financial side of the house is taken care of. So, we do that with a platform that utilities buy from us, utilities use it, but also they make it available to their end customers. And they make it available on all the platforms that customers today want. Their mobile phones, their laptop or tablet. We can communicate with them by voice, by text, and even by paper if necessary.
Very cool. So I'm a utilities company. How do I kind of go about using your product?
So if you're a utility company, you probably have one of three topics top of mind, and probably actually all three of them are in your top five. But utility executives, and I speak with them every week, almost every day. They are generally concerned about quality of service,
okay,
about financial viability for the utility in the short and long term, and about being able to get support from their stakeholders. And those stakeholders mean regulators, legislators, and customers. And so what we do for them is we take a little bit of data that they already capture and use in their normal course of business, a couple of data streams, and we combine that with about 7 or 8 other data streams that we assemble on a broad basis. And we combine those at huge volume. So we're looking at over 1 billion data points every hour.
Oh, wow.
And we're looking for patterns and anomalies. And what we can do with that is we can help them visualize what's going on within their utility, maybe across the whole utility, in a particular subdivision or region, right down to an individual consumer. So we give them a dashboard which allows them, 21st century high quality visualization analytics for all of their customer service staff, their operations staff, their sustainability staff, financial staff, and so And then what we do is we help them forge this trusted channel of communication out to their customers, because it turns out that most customers don't spend a lot of time thinking about water.
Sure. No, that
And
I would agree with that. Yeah.
so then basically what we do is we use that sort of process data in order to have a completely customized conversation, a personalized conversation with each and every single customer.
Interesting.
So this isn't one message broadcast to everybody, regardless of their situation. It's a specific message for you based on where you live, how many people you live with, what the weather's doing, what the supply system is doing. Everything is personalized and appropriate to that point in time.
So would you like send the customer like a notification saying you're using too much water, or like how does that kind of work? Like what are you kind of analyzing? Because I kind of see you guys almost like you're almost like the Nest but for like water, where the Nest really made people start actually caring and watching kind of the heat and the stuff that that they're using in their house, or their AC, I should say. And so I kind of see what you guys are doing kind of in just the water industry kind of compared to the Nest. And everybody I know that has one loves the thing, actually cares, and it gets them really starting to think about how much kind of energy they're using. Is that a fair comparison?
I think that's a pretty good first comparison, actually. When it depends a lot on where in the world we're working with a utility, right? Some
Okay.
utilities care a lot about water use, some care more about energy use, some care about greenhouse gases, some care about stormwater or wastewater, or as we've seen in the papers this last month, water quality.
Sure.
But the key thing is that utilities have traditionally focused on running the pipes and pumps and plants really well. They focused on that quality of service thing, but they've often neglected the fact that some elements of what people perceive as quality of service are not really to do with those physical assets.
Right.
You're inevitably going to get at some point water main breaks or outages for maintenance or things like that.
Sure.
And people's perception of the service level is very different if you say, hey, this is coming up, it's going to be on Monday morning, and then maybe on Monday morning you say, just reminding you, the
Right.
water is going to be off from 10 until further notice, but we estimate that the service will be completed by 12 o'clock. We'll send you a text to follow up to let you know when it's safe to proceed.
Very cool.
That kind of layered and precise communication, this is kind of the antidote to what we still think of, although it's actually largely become not so true in a lot of parts of the country, at least now, but as the sort of the cable TV guy experience.
Right.
Yeah, I'll be there between Tuesday and Friday.
but you have to be home.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. So from the customer side, can I like what do I see from the app, or the kind of the web app?
So what you'll see is information about your own use.
Okay.
We make sure that customers only ever actually see their own data.
Sure.
Right? So this is not about shaming or violating anyone's privacy or anything like that, because one, that would be wrong, and two, actually it's counterproductive. But what we do let them do is to benchmark themselves against what we know would represent a normal usage pattern for their particular situation. So if you live in a 2,700 square foot home, 270 square meters, on a 11,000 square foot lot, and it's in a particular zip code, and therefore we know how big your yard is, we know what the weather is and the climate is for that zip code. We know perhaps that you've got 3 people in the house. We know the house was built in 1978. All these different factors, we work those into our model, and that's how we can come up with a very accurate estimate of how much water you should be using on that basis, and where it's being used. And so, we can have a contextual conversation with you. So if there's a storm front coming into town, we know when that storm front hits not the city or not the zip code, but your street.
Interesting.
And so that helps us to communicate very precisely with people. And, look, if you've got a big storm coming in, you want to make sure that and you know that there have been blockages in the past, you want to make sure that the catch basin outside your house is not blocked. And of course,
yeah,
the cities will go out and try to keep that clear and so on. But in the end, it's your basement, not theirs, that is going to get flooded.
sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm kind of curious to know, like, some more of the features, I guess, either whether they're implemented now or kind of coming in the future, because this whole space is kind of fascinating to me, where you almost control and you're more aware of kind of what you're putting out there, and kind of how you can kind of monitor what you're doing and not doing in these kind of, I would say, kind of archaic industries, and you're modernizing this kind of archaic industry.
I think that's one way to look at it, I suppose. I mean, I think, nobody underestimates how smart the folks are in this industry.
Sure.
But I think that the industry has been built with billions, in fact trillions of dollars of investment in physical plant, and with people who have skills in running that physical infrastructure.
Right.
And that was the right thing to do when we had lower population density, less urbanization, and the lack of whatever it is that's going on with the weather and the climate right now.
Sure.
At a minimum, more variability and maybe some permanent long-term changes. So I think this is really an evolution, and these types of evolution, particularly when there's so much sort of sunk capital in terms of both money and human capital, intellectual capital, they're inevitably situations where change happens almost imperceptibly at first, and then all of a sudden. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the beginning of that all of a sudden capability. And that's why we've managed to pick up 50 plus utilities,
Wow.
coast to coast in the US, and continue to be marching forward.
Sure. So are you guys gonna eventually kind of move outside the US market, or is that just kind of, you don't really know where you're gonna end up?
So the nature of the startup business is that you never really know where you end up, but we certainly perceive this as a global opportunity. I mean, ultimately, the opportunity here is to change the way that the 5 billion people in the world who are connected to city water interact with their utility and use and think about water. So this is a global opportunity,
Sure.
and I think later this year we'll start poking around with some of the international market to evaluate, which is the best next step.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. And I love kind of adding technology to different industries. It's always kind of fascinating to me. So I'm kind of curious though, why, for people out there that don't really know, kind of like, why is this important? Because the example that's kind of resonated with me, I was in Los Angeles last year during the drought, and about a few weeks later, I was in San Francisco. And you ask anybody, well, I shouldn't say anybody, but we asked a few people when we were in LA about, like, oh, like, so what's with the drought? And I got majority of people answered, oh, that's somebody else's problem. They'll figure it out. You go to San Francisco and you see signs everywhere saying, like, conserve water, we're in a drought, blah blah blah. Like, people seem to not really care in Southern California, where in San Francisco, a lot of people really cared about it. And I'm not saying the general public, it's just, we asked a handful of people, and it seemed just like, even in different parts of California, the perception of it was quite different.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say about water is it's simultaneously a global problem, but also very localized in terms of how it presents. And so, look, if you're in the southeast of the country, then stormwater is a much bigger issue than drought. If you're in the northeast of the country, then it might be more about wastewater.
Right.
If you're in the sort of Chicagoland area, it may be about infrastructure renewal. And clearly, once you're west of the 100th meridian, sort of roughly runs up and down through Nebraska, then the whole population migration west and southward, plus the fact it was already a fairly arid environment, really does mean that that conservation is at least on the list for many communities. But our point is that you have to have a conversation, you have to seize the agenda of that conversation, and fundamentally for these folks who are not set up to do it, we help them have a conversation, have an interaction with their community that allows the whole community to get pulling in the same direction. And the reason to do that, other than it's, look, it's lovely to be liked and all the rest of it, but the reason to do that goes back to those three issues: the quality of service, the financial viability, and the stakeholder support. If you don't get stakeholder support, then you won't have a financially viable business. And the reason is that, a lot of rates are set based on regulatory and legislator input. And if the citizens hate you, you will not get the rates that you need to make the investments you need. If you don't make those investments in the long term or the short term, you can't maintain quality of service. And one thing we do know, we sort of knew it already, but we've been, really had a rude awakening and a reminder of it in the past month or so, is that if the water is coming out, looking funny, tasting funny, and smelling funny, you do not have stakeholder support. So all these three things are very much linked.
Okay.
And I think that, the question really is, what is the message, what is the theme, and what are the mechanisms that you're going to use in order to engage in that communication? And you've got to be where the people want to be. That's just the reality of today.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious to know kind of, how do you guys monetize this, or how do you charge the the water companies?
We charge the utilities based on essentially the number of customer connections they have, the number of meters, think in those terms,
Sure.
and based on which services we're running for them. So we always run analytics for 100% of the meters that are in a particular utility.
Okay.
At the same time, once we look at those analytics, we can have a conversation with the utility and say, from what we're seeing and what we know about your policy environment and your ecological environment and so on, you should be running these kinds of programs or those kinds of programs.
Oh, interesting.
And so it really depends, how many meters and how many programs of how many different types. And so it sort of layers, it's a layer cake kind of business model.
Okay.
And it's based on an annual subscription. This allows utilities to reduce their operational costs, to manage their capital costs, to, get better customer satisfaction scores, to, navigate the political and financial and operational realities that they have to.
Sure. So do you have kind of different packages that you offer different utility companies then? It sounds like you do.
Yes, we do. Yeah. So we as I say, everybody gets the analytics.
Right.
And then we do what we call the engagement piece. And, we tend to do that for some subset, some non-100% number of the end consumers, although some communities do it 100%. And then we may run simultaneously. We might be running some programs on for disadvantaged communities, and we may be running other programs about stormwater mitigation. And so, if somebody has a large and diverse district, they might be running 2 or 3 or 4 different programs at the same time.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so do you also provide the different companies with data from not necessarily like, or from other utility companies in other parts of the country that are in kind of have a similar population size and kind of climate and whatnot? Even if you don't mention the name, do you kind of say, you're comparable to, these, and then you kind of rate them, or is that something that is not really useful or you're not really doing?
So we look at this actually a lot in the in the sort of data science lab here, and we're seeing a lot of evidence that is potentially useful. We don't currently do it yet,
Okay.
but we're certainly investigating the extent to which that can be presented in a form that's useful, and with an appropriate set of controls around confidentiality and all the rest of it. And
Right.
really what we're talking about is anonymized data, and the question is much more about how do you end up with a good statistical match from one utility to another. And the evidence appears to indicate that that's not necessarily, another utility that's in the same metro area or even the same state. And that would make sense to us sort of philosophically, because, when we're doing those comparisons at the consumer level, where we show them kind of an anonymized average benchmark for somebody who looks just like them, it is almost never literally their next door neighbor. So,
Right.
so that, that's something that we're investigating, and we do think that all of these kind of meta levels of comparison and of benchmarking have a great deal of value for the utilities themselves, and also for the regulators and legislators who need to work out what sort of policy and what sort of regulations and practices to
Sure.
implement in their particular watersheds or state.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The other thing I'm kind of curious about, and I'm curious if it's even possible, is if you have the data on kind of how old infrastructure is in certain cities, could you potentially predict when a pipe's going to burst, or other things, and say like, oh, this is could potentially going to burst, in 2 months, maybe you should send some guys out there to check on it? Like, could you do stuff like that?
So this type of technique can do that, but that's not what we do. So we really focus very much on this kind of customer interaction sphere.
Okay.
In that more operational and supply distribution network sphere, there are other folks who actually do that kind of stuff. It actually depends a good deal on having a certain critical mass in terms of sensor networks. Some cities are starting to get there in the US, but in general, the US is not well served in terms of having that fully meshed sensor network that allows you to get enough data to really model this stuff out. And as you pointed out, a lot of cities have old infrastructure, and one of the opportunities that you get when you start replacing infrastructure is the ability to embed the sensors in the right place. So that's tough to do when, for example, even in the nation's capital, in DC, the average age of a water main is 76 years.
Oh, wow.
Which is unfortunate, because the useful lifetime of those things is 50 to 75 years.
Okay.
Which is the essence of the problem.
Sure. Okay. No, that's really interesting. So I'm kind of curious to know, where do you guys kind of see WaterSmart kind of going in the future?
I think there are 3 answers to that. I think one, we definitely will investigate the opportunity for geographical expansion. Water, by its very nature, is absolutely essential to the life and to the livelihoods of us all. I think secondly, we see an opportunity to really do some combination of building out, partnering, teaming up with other firms who are using digital science approaches, maybe to tackle things like that, operational or that, some of the deeper financial aspects of the equation, to create this sort of complete 360-degree view, cockpit view for utilities, so they really start to become truly data-driven. And I think the third thing is that, we will see a progressive ability to create more and more value from what here we call kind of the data moat. That's to say, the very fact that you have more and more data, that we're already addressing enormous volumes of data, it allows you to develop more precise algorithms. It allows you to develop new ways to create value for everybody, from the customer to the utility manager to the regulator to the legislator, and also because this is a big money endeavor in the water utility business, to the people who are going to be the sources of financing for that. Right. Because the investment gap in the U.S., because of that old infrastructure, it exceeds $1 trillion.
Oh, wow.
And, if you're going to invest $1 trillion, you probably want to know where to prioritize, because you're not going to write $1 trillion check in one go.
Sure.
So what to do first, and you want to be able to measure what your return is. And that's part of our hope in driving this data-driven future for the utility community.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm kind of curious, is there anything that you guys have kind of found just now that you started collecting all this data and you have a bunch of it now that kind of surprised you, or anything that you kind of really learned that you were like, oh, I never would have thought of that? I'm always curious to know that with kind of big data companies like yourselves.
I think there's a bunch of things that we learn. There's lots of micro stuff that's not really appropriate to share in this format, but
Sure.
But there's also, some of these things like, is the best comparison my neighbor? And it's absolutely not. And that's not our instinctive sort of human reaction.
Interesting. So what is the best comparison?
So the best comparison, we model for about 8 or 9 parameters, but I mean, we match based on house size,
right? Okay, family size, etc.
Number of people in the home, age of the home.
Right.
Look, geography matters, but you can get a statistical match for what the weather and what they call the ETO, basically the evaporation rates are on any given day in a whole bunch of different places across even a large territory like the US. And they aren't adjacent to each other.
Interesting. No, that's very cool. But Robin, we're kind of running out of time, so I wonder if let's close the show maybe kind of promoting where people can find WaterSmart online, any social media, and if you want to promote anything personally.
I would certainly tell people that they can go and learn about this on www.watersmart.com. They can find us on Twitter on @GetWaterSmart, and we have a whole array of blogs and white papers and regularly run public events, including webinars and all the rest, so that people can inform themselves. And we certainly want to see an engaged community around this type of problem.
Sure. No, I think that's awesome. And I think it's super important. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think now that, you guys are kind of out there doing this, I think a lot of people are going to start caring and really start thinking about this stuff a lot more.
That's certainly our hope. Water is delicious and essential and irreplaceable.
Sure.
And you would think that we would take more care of it. And frankly, soon we may have to.
Yeah, well, even in certain parts of the world, we already have to.
Yeah.
So, no, all right. Well, Robin, well, thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to kind of following you guys throughout the year and in the future.
Okay, very good.
All right.
Thanks
Well,
very much, Kevin.
we'll talk soon. Have a good one.
You too.
Okay.
Great to talk.
Okay. Bye. Thanks for listening. The music for the show was done by Electric Mantra. You can check them out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.